Welcome to the Brand Fortress HQ podcast. And in this Amazon Tactics Tuesday, we're going to be talking about cumulative effects, and we're going to be talking about how you get that flywheel moving. So this is a discussion that we've been having before we started to record. And before we get kind of into the nitty gritty, I'm actually going to hand it off to you, Mike, first, where we're talking about singular effects versus compounding effects on Amazon, and share a little bit with our listeners kind of how you think about those two different aspects of improving your listings and really moving that flywheel forward.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess really what it comes down to is, it's like, everybody's heard, that kind of saying, focus on the 20% that gives you the 80% of the results. And I think there are definitely certain things on Amazon where, addressing one singular component has downstream effects on multiple other algorithmic factors. And so you get kind of this flywheel, cumulative effect that happens. Whereas there are other things that maybe they're important things to do on Amazon, but if given the choice between them, you might want to choose that kind of flywheel effect option versus, say, something that really addresses more of a singular type thing. Like, for instance, adding, virtual bundles to your listing. Like, it's useful. There's some help there, but it doesn't necessarily have massive cumulative or snowball-like effects on your listing. And so you have to make those decisions, which of those aspects of your listing or of your Amazon strategy are you going to focus on?
So when you're weighing those out, can you give some examples of the ones that you see at the top of your list when you think about the cumulative effects?
Yeah, for sure. The easy ones, I think, the ones that, it's interesting because they're elements that everybody knows you should work on. And to some degree, we all do. But most of the time, we don't place nearly enough emphasis on them and we don't come back to them frequently enough. And that would be our title and our main image. So the reason I would consider those both to be this kind of, or at least that they have the potential for having this kind of flywheel effect on your listing and this cumulative, growth factor is, let's take your title, for instance. If your title is written properly, it's got a hook, it's using the proper keywords that are going to get you the most response. It's got your USP in there so that there's a differentiator between you and your competitors. Like, there's certain things that should be in that title. And if you nail it properly, the interesting thing is that, okay, so the title shows up in the search results, which obviously then is going to have an effect on your click-through rate. So the number of sessions that you're going to actually get to the listing. But then once somebody gets to the listing, already your title has prepared them for what they're going to see on the listing, hopefully. And if you presented the hook properly and you presented your USP properly, they're actually going to spend more time on your listing looking for the details that prove out that USP, that actually give them what they want to know about whatever the hook was. So they're going to spend more time on your page, which is an actual factor for Amazon. They want to know how much time is somebody spending on your page. But then beyond that, the more time they spend on your page, the more likely they actually purchase, right? So your conversion rate goes up, and your title had that effect, right? You prep them with that title. So it not only affects your click-through rate, but if you've done it properly, it also affects your conversion rate. So what's interesting there is click-through rate gives you more sessions. Conversion rate takes more of those sessions and turns them into orders, which means you have orders of magnitude higher sales volume just from a CTR and CVR improvement, right? That compounds on each other. But then you have downstream effects from that. So now we've got the algorithm in terms of search ranking not only takes into account click-through rate, also takes into account conversion rate, also takes into account sales volume and sales volume trajectory. Like, those are all factors in the ranking algorithm. So you just improved CTR, CVR, you improved your sales volume, and your sales volume trajectory is on the upswing, right? So all four of those factors, which are major aspects in the ranking algorithm, are better, which means you're going to rank better. And not just for a single keyword, but for every keyword that you're indexed for, you're going to rank better. What does ranking better mean? It means more sessions, which means more sales. And all of those sessions now have a better conversion rate than they would have had before. So you get more sales out of those sessions than you would have gotten, which raises your BSR even further, which is a ranking factor, which is going to, so you've got this massive cumulative flywheel that goes on from one single change. So if you're not running Amazon experiments on your title all the time to see what you could do better, how you could improve the hook, how you could improve the keywords that you're using, or whatever it is, then you're losing out on that flywheel effect. And again, title is not very sexy, right? Like it's, there's a lot of these hacks that you see, like everybody wants to, to focus in on the hacks, and some of them are great, but those foundational basics, if you're not focusing in on those things that give you the flywheel, you're missing massive opportunities.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to double click on there. The first is that I think this is one of the biggest principles to understand on Amazon, which is incremental improvement can lead to exponential sales. So if you think about it of, hey, I increased my conversion rate by 2%, that may not seem like a big deal, but over the course of 30 to 60 days, it may be enough to get you ahead of your competition to where your product goes from, fifth organically for one of your, some of your major keywords to second organically. And because there's such an exponential difference between, those being in the top 3 versus being in number 10 or below, right, that, just those, incremental improvements can give you a massive boost in sales.
Well, and if you think about it too, and I want to hear, kind of what Matt has to say too, but something to think about too, when you're looking at the search listings, especially on mobile, and since mobile is becoming such a massive part of the sales, cycle, even more than desktop for sure now. If you look at that and you look at how many sponsored listings show up in there, the further down you are, like the difference between being number 4 and being number 3 is actually more like the difference between being number 7 and number 3, because you've got multiple sponsored listings that show up in between there. So there's more scrolling necessary. So, like what you're talking about, if the person who's above you in the number, if you're at number 4 and somebody else is number 3, if the differential between those two listings, your listing and theirs, is this very minor, conversion rate adjustment, like maybe there's only 2% difference, between your conversion rate and theirs, but all of a sudden now you make that differential with your title, and now you went from number 4 to number 3. But again, that's more like being from number 7 to number 3. So who knows? Yeah. It might be 2-3 times as many sales between, with that little bit of a jump.
Yeah, one of the things that stood out with what you talked about is the kind of the structure of the title and what's important to put in there. I see so many titles in the search results that are still a keyword salad of just a bunch of keywords that, if you read it as a sentence, don't really make a whole lot of sense. Like that, it's part art, part science with your title. The same thing with your main image, and that's, I think, so little people pay little attention to the fact that you have to be able, yes, Amazon's algorithm is important, but also so is the consumer that ends up hitting the buy now button. So if that doesn't make sense to them, and it's just a bunch of keywords that you feel are important, you're missing out on part of the art part of that listing. So, that it's super important to also pay attention to that when you're doing your experiments, is how can you also speak to the consumer at the same time, because that's going to increase your conversion rate as well.
Yeah, and a couple of things that I think are really important there is, and Mike, you pointed out, which is Manage My Experiments, which I think is probably one of the most powerful and underutilized tools that Amazon gives you, because it really is the only way to accurately split test different parts of your listing. And it's important to know that it's not just your title or main image, although those generally have the biggest impact on your click-through rate and conversion that we're talking about, and kind of moving those metrics. But now they've opened up secondary images. They've opened up other aspects. I think your A+ content has been open for a while. So, if your product is eligible, you really should be running some sort of experiment all the time.
All the time.
And I've run enough of these experiments to know that, you never know what works and what doesn't until you test it. Things that you think are going to do amazing end up doing worse than, kind of an okay title that you have, and other things that you're like, well, this seems a little goofy, but we'll give it a try, end up converting really, really well.
That's a
Yeah, I
mantra
think
that I say to myself all the time. It doesn't matter what I think; it matters what they think.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. And
yeah.
actually, it's very interesting. Like, I really feel like the best marketers are the ones that really take that to heart and recognize that. Like,
Hmm.
yes, you
Totally.
should be thinking through what the copy looks like and what it is that you're writing, and who is your target, and what do they care about. All of those things are critical, obviously, and you want somebody who understands that to be writing your copy. But by the same token, if you don't understand that very foundational principle, that you're not selling to you, you're selling to the customer, and you don't actually know what they want until they tell you. And
Hmm.
the easiest way for them to tell you is for you to run the experiment and let
Test
them
it.
tell you.
Yep. Test it.
Yeah. Well, and I do want to talk a little bit more tactics for title specifically, because that's something that I just have a strong interest in because I think it's very underutilized. But before I do that, one thing that um, also comes to my mind is that I think a lot of people don't know is when it comes to main image, there's a lot of questions now like, hey, is my main image terms of service compliant? What are the boundaries? Because I mean, it is kind of, there's gotten to be some gray area. And I think one of the things that Manage My Experiments does is helps eliminate that gray area because they all get reviewed by Amazon before you can have that new main image tested. So if you're able to set up an experiment with that new main image, you're almost guaranteed that Amazon's going to see it as terms of service compliant.
Yeah.
I don't know if
So it's
it's
a
a
Yeah. It
different
does,
team
it
or
does provide you a
a
nice
different
filter.
algorithm. I don't know if it's a different team or algorithm, but I've actually had better luck in getting images that kind of were on the gray side of things approved in Manage My Experiments than I have just uploading it to the back end of the listing. I've had better luck with those kind of gray area ones than I have with Manage My Experiments. So there's that too.
So here's a question for you, Matt, that I would be interested to know what your experience is there. So in those situations where you were running a semi-gray area type image on Manage Experiments and you got it through the filter, right? So you got to run the experiment. How many of those images that were those kind of more gray images ended up being the winner of the experiment and went live on your listing and went through just fine, even though if you had just simply uploaded them directly to your listing, they wouldn't have?
Very high. I mean, I don't want to say 100% because there's probably one or two that I'm not remembering. But if they went through, first of all, the images that I use and Manage My Experiments, in my opinion, and I've run enough to know that the gray area that we're talking about is like, not a recipe, but an ingredient that's, let's call it like a topical ingredient that's inside of the lotion, having that like poke out of behind the packaging. That's kind of the stuff that I'm talking about, or having food inside of a container. I knew that from running as much of these experiments that it was going to be the winner, but once I was able to sneak it through and Manage My Experiment and it won, I can only think of one time that it didn't actually go through and went through and ended up being the listing or the image that showed up on the listing. So very, very high likelihood that if it wins, it's going to show up on your listing.
Cool.
Yeah. So we talk about main image. I do want to come back to titles because I think that there's a lot there. Um, the first piece I would say, again, for conversions, Manage My Experiments is a fantastic way to see, to actually test which title converts better than the others. And then I also want to come back to what you talked about, Matt, which is that combination of art and science. And I think this is what trips a lot of people up is they're like, well, I'm just going to throw my best keywords into there. And the problem with that is that, like you said, at the end of the day, somebody has to click on that and buy that product. And, your title is probably 80% of the copy of what they see. And so it really does have to have your, unique selling proposition and, or what differentiates you and what's the benefit to the customer along with those keywords. And what I would add into that is that really needs to be, well, two things. One, it needs to be in the first 80 characters, because I think what a lot of people forget is that, 60 to 70% of our shoppers now are on mobile, and those titles, yeah, you can put 150, 160 characters in your title, but on mobile, they get truncated down to about 80 characters. So yeah, it's great to put those keywords in there, especially some of the keywords that, get you the visibility that you need. But just be aware that customers, may not see those benefits if you put them at the very end of your title. And so they may not even click on your product to know, hey, this is the right product for me.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really, it's very key, right? Is just knowing there are sections of your title. I mean, you should be dividing your title up into, to some degree, sections. And that first section is, okay, I've got my mobile visible portion. That's where I need the hook, I need the USP, and maybe I need at least one best keyword that I can use to describe my item that's a clear description of what it is. It's obvious that keyword relates to what I'm selling. It's a high volume keyword. And it's one that if somebody sees that keyword in my title, and that's what they search for, it is very likely that they're interested in my product. And so it preps them, so if I've got the USP, I've got the hook, and I've got the keyword. And also, I think it's relevant here to take a step back and recognize too, if your brand is not really a recognized brand that people are searching for, if you can get away with it, do not put your brand at the front of the title, in my opinion. There might be some people who would disagree with me, but I say put it at the end, because if they're not looking for you, now you've just taken up, especially, I mean, okay, if your brand is 6 characters, fine, maybe put it at the beginning. But, like Pro Tough Products, like our brand, it takes up 15 characters at the beginning of our title. Now for us, nowadays, they're searching for our brand. A lot of people are searching for our brand. So I use it. Now, sometimes I'll just put Pro Tough if I can get away with it because they still know it's us. But just be careful with that because you use a lot of characters with the brand name. And if nobody's really looking for your brand, you need to decide whether you actually want your brand up front.
Yeah, how many categories exist now that don't require it? Every category that I sell in, it requires the brand name in the front now.
I've been able to get away with it. I still don't always have the Pro Tough at the beginning. Now, I will say it's dependent. It changes listing to listing. Sometimes it goes, sometimes it doesn't.
So
interesting.
Entirely category dependent or not.
Yeah. So doing some testing with this here, my experience with it has been, and I've yet to have this happen. I've only heard it from other people. So I've done both brand upfront or, just straight into the benefits. And like you said, Mike, there's definitely an advantage if you're not a big brand name or if you have a long brand name and, it takes up 20 characters. I mean, that really leaves you with very little real estate to go through those benefits. So my understanding, and again, category to category, but as far as the Amazon rules, you're supposed to have your brand name up front. And there is a small chance that if you don't have your brand name up front, that Amazon will lock you out of making any changes to that listing for not complying to that rule. Now, I think that's one of those, kind of 1 in 10,000, type issues. So it's important to be aware that what Amazon wants and what the potential consequences are. So that way you can weigh it with kind of where you're at in your brand. And like you said, maybe you start out when you're just getting out of the gate and you really focus on the benefits and you don't have that brand name up front. And then as the product matures, you can always make that change in order to eliminate that risk.
Right. Yeah.
It's such valuable real estate, those first 15, 20 characters, like we've already mentioned. I mean, if you can get away with it, then, certainly for me, even if I have a brand name that is starting to get recognizable, I would rather use those first, 15, 20 characters for as many as the hook and the USP and all of that stuff. So yeah, if you can get away with it, but I can't in my categories, unfortunately.
Yeah. The other thing that I would encourage, well, I guess, what are your guys' thoughts around, because this is one of the areas where I wish Manage My Experiments was better. What are your thoughts around measuring CTR for a new title? Because obviously you can see conversion rate, but Manage My Experiments doesn't give you any click-through rate data.
Now, do you get, I can't remember, with Manage My Experiments, do you get the number of sessions that went through, that they're going to be equal? It's an equal number of sessions. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if there's a good way. Honestly, I mean, the only thing that I could think, and even then it's not perfect, but if the experiment that you're running is actually current title versus new title, right? Then you could theoretically look at what was your CTR run up, like your over, like if you went into your, say, your ads, or even your search query performance, I guess, basically,
Yeah.
you could look at your run up CTR for the previous week, on that product, and then you could compare it to the CTR of that product during the week that the experiment ran. And whatever that differential is, you would have to attribute, and it would actually be technically double that, right? Because only 50% of the traffic over that 7 days of the experiment went to the new one. So if your CTR went up by, say, we'll just make it easy numbers. If it went up by 10 points, then technically that's a 20-point increase in CTR. I think that's how the math would work out, because only half of your traffic was actually running through the higher CTR, title. Does that make sense? Would that be true?
Yeah. I think, because I mean, so we do look at the search query report to kind of get a gauge on that. Although we do take a little bit longer look than at least a few weeks prior to kind of try to get what that baseline is, to identify what that baseline is, and then look at it as it's running the experiment. But yeah, you bring up a good point in the sense of, if your click-through rate went up, 10 points, then considering that traffic is split between your old title and the new one that you're testing, really your results are going to be, in one direction or the other, double what you're seeing in your search query report. And then I think the other, kind of detail that's important for folks to know is that, use your search query report or use your Amazon ads, but don't compare those two numbers together, because they're measured very, very differently. So you could,
Right.
both of those, if you're looking at click-through rates for your ads, and if you've got, exact match hero campaigns, then you can do that, and get some data off of that, to compare your click-through rate. But don't combine that with your search query report, because those numbers are calculated differently.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing that you'd have to pay attention to also, if you're going to try to use that data in that way, to verify a CTR improvement or decrease, would be, you have to be careful that you hadn't made any significant changes on the PPC side, in terms of what keywords you were advertising on or not. Because if you're looking at an overall CTR, and previously you were advertising on some keyword that was crappy CTR, and you just removed it, from its campaign, all of a sudden now, you've skewed those numbers already, and it had nothing to do with the title. So you'd have to be careful there that you're not, corrupting that data.
Yeah, I really think that the search query report is a much better way of tracking that than trying to do it through ads.
And search query, correct me if I'm wrong, SQP, is that solely organic traffic that's being tracked there? Or is it cumulative? Everything?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Because that would be the only thing, is that potentially, now at least it would be less corrupted than the PPC data, which is specific. And if you had changed out your keywords or anything that in a significant way that could be affected, SQP would be less, because at least half of it, hopefully is organic. But if it's all organic, then that would eliminate that issue entirely. And I'm not sure the answer, but.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll have to look. For some reason, my guess is that it is organic traffic. It's not total traffic, but I'd have to take a look at the Amazon console, because I think if you dig into some of the details, it does have tell you whether it's organic traffic or total traffic.
Yeah. I wanted to pop back to something that we talked about a few minutes ago. You were talking about the sometimes those small changes can have more of an exponential effect, and we kind of referred to that idea of even just a slight ranking change could have a very significant effect. But I wanted to relate that to, we've had a conversation with Brian Johnson about, about his tool DeepM, but he was talking about ranking and how you basically have ranking shelves, where you might have, a cluster of, say 10 or 20 competitors who essentially are, we'll say, for lack of any better way to say it, identical in terms of, algorithmically how Amazon is looking at them. And so they kind of form this little shelf of very similar metrics. And if you're sitting below that shelf and you make a very small change, you could easily jump 20 spots because you jump that entire shelf, because all of those products are basically, all in that grouping of metrics, and you leapfrog that entire shelf. So again, same principle here, a very small change, especially like a title change that could improve CTR, CVR, sessions, orders, all of that, which all of a sudden now puts you above in multiple categories of everybody in that shelf. You could jump from number 25 to number 5.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important point too. And it really comes back to, we like to think of things as linear, but Amazon works in exponentials, and understanding that incremental improvement can have a huge impact. So
that was such a fascinating concept that makes total sense, but not one that I had ever thought of before he mentioned it. I mean, imagine how the effect of that. You just talked about the difference of 7 and 3 being much more prominent on mobile, but imagine a 10 position change or a 15 position change because you've increased over that shelf. I mean, that's massive. It
truly is massive, especially because like we were saying, Amazon throws so many sponsored listings in there these days that, if you're number 20, you're actually more like number 35 at this point, because of all the sponsored listings.
Yeah.
So for the folks that are listening, what do you think would be a good takeaway item for them to where they can at least start down this path in order to take advantage of these incremental improvements?
The first thing is test. Use manage my experiment. Like that's first off and foremost is if you're not always testing, like you should always have at least one experiment going. Always, whether it be your main image or your title, something should be testing. And it's fascinating to me how many sellers aren't using that tool effectively.
And I would take that a step further, and I'll put myself on the hot seat with this because we have not been very good about consistently using manage my experiments. So it's like, here I'm teaching this and it's true. Like there's nothing, all of what I'm saying is absolutely true. But, just like every other business, you're always constrained by how many man hours do you have available to you, based on the size of your team and what other projects you're working on and whatnot. And so some things get left, right? And because the title and main image oftentimes are kind of this more, it's just so obvious that it doesn't even happen, right? And manage my experiments the same way. We are looking at the possibility of even bringing in somebody that's all their job is to do experiments on all of our listings all the time and be managing them. Because if we don't have the manpower on our team to do it, it is such an important piece of what we should be doing, then we better bring somebody on. Even if, and it doesn't have to be like manage my experience is not that hard, right? Like, I mean, literally it's just pick something to change, like look at a competitor, see what they're doing that looks like maybe it's better than what you're doing, implement that in your title or on your listing, right? Run the experiment and let Amazon tell you which one was the better one. You don't have to hire a rock star to do that. Like you can hire a fairly basic freelancer that has good English and that's sufficient. So if you don't have enough hours in the day, bring somebody onto the team to do it because you need to be doing this.
Yep.
Yeah, I will push back a little bit on that though, Mike, just because, what I see is, a lot of people get frustrated because they don't get results from it because they're not doing it in thinking about it systematically as far as like doing the research up front of looking at their search query report to know like, hey, which are the most important keywords? Which ones am I actually, finding that formula where I'm not, I'm getting more clicks or my click rate is higher than my impression rate. Pulling down that data of, like you said, from the customer's perspective, looking through your reviews and your competitors' reviews to know, like, hey, what do customers love about my product, but they don't like about my competitor's product, where you can identify those pain points and doing that research. I think it's definitely trainable to do.
Fair. I agree with you. I agree with you that those are all great things that you probably should be doing. What I'm saying is, if the difference between you not doing it and doing it is that you don't have somebody on your team and you don't really feel like you have the money to invest in somebody who's a little bit higher level and kind of understands some of those, principles, literally just having somebody throw up 2 titles that even just that person thinks maybe one's better than the other. We already said earlier in this conversation, you don't ever know. And I would be shocked if you had somebody on your team that was running experiments on your title and they just once a week changed the title to something else that they thought might operate better, and they had even just a rudimentary understanding of how titles operate and how copy should be, right? In 3 months, you probably still have a better title than you had 3 months ago that's getting better click-through rate and conversion rate, even if they know almost nothing. Now, if you've got somebody on your team who knows what they're doing, it could be exponentially better than that. But I'm just saying, taking those 2 scenarios, I'm not going to do it or I am going to do it.
Yeah, it's definitely better to, move forward rather than worrying about perfect. I'll agree with that. Although I will say, just so that way, my experience has been that, with those tests, you generally need at least a few weeks worth of data before Amazon Experiments has enough to really tell you whether what you've done is better or not. So, I mean, it's good to be doing something, but also understand that you probably, one experiment a month is probably more realistic than one experiment a week if you're using Manage My Experiments.
Yeah, ultimately it depends on volume, right? The more volume you've got going through your listing, the faster Amazon can determine. And also the larger the differential in performance between the two. If you got a title that's just way outperforming, it takes far less data for Amazon to determine that, and if there's only a slight difference, then you need a lot more data. So, but if you got volume running through, you can do an experiment in a week and you can probably get to a result. But if it's a lower volume product, expect that it's going to take longer. But either way, whether it takes a week or a month, you still should be running it.
And that's 100% the takeaway is that, for anybody who's listening to this is you should be, I would start with your hero products. So figure out what those, top, you probably know off the top of your head what your top 2, 3, or 5 products are. Start there and then work your way down and, work to a point where you really should, every product that is eligible for it, you should be running some sort of experiment all the time, whether that's on the title or the main image, because it can only help you when it comes to, conversion rate and making that incremental improvement that can exponentially boost your sales.
Yep, for sure.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody who for listening. Love to hear your feedback on and results from running Manage My Experiments. And until next time, we'll have next week another Amazon Tactics Tuesday.